knowing the individuals, the ones who tested positive, where they live, where they work. And we know the kind of rumor mongering society that we are, where there are still discrimination against people living with such conditions. And it's so serious that a couple of years ago, the Nigerian government had to actually legislate specifically on HIV or AIDS discrimination. So that's how serious it is. Essentially, when you're thinking of record management, you want to be thinking of storage limitation. Don't keep the data for longer than you need it. So, interestingly, I'll go back to there's this particular law which is guideline on document and record retention. Though specifically the addresses laboratory scientists was made by their professional body. So addresses laboratory society, but things like X-ray results, they were all given timeline on how long you can store them. So if there is a law, for example, prescribing how long a particular spreadsheet of data should be stored, then it means you can't keep it longer than that. If there is a contract in place between you and a customer, for example, whether they're using your mobile app, for example, and maybe in the contract you said this is how long you're going to keep it, or maybe in the terms of use you said this is how long you're going to stay the data, for example, then it means you can't keep it beyond the contractual period. Then also, the business need might also define your retention period and some other things. All most important thing is also that it has to be reasonable. If all you need the data for is maybe even after given care, you need it for maybe let's say you need to keep it for just 6 years thereabouts, 10 years thereabouts. Why are you keeping it for 50 years? Why do you need it for? It's taking up space. It's even more expensive to keep data for longer than you need them. And I don't know if anyone has actually visited a public facility before, maybe a public hospital or something. You know how those stack and stack of files and each other, and it's so difficult to find things. That's what happens exactly when you can't properly manage your records. Also, you want to be concerned about security. And security is so important because aside the fact that you have so many different laws saying you should ensure security, these things have real life consequences on people. So if someone who is not meant to have an access, who is not meant to have access to data, for example, have such access. I already gave the example of how a gubernatorial candidate in a particular state was part of an election banter or election vicious cycle we see in the country. That's something that could have, if that escalated beyond what it was, for example, and maybe the health condition is maybe something where in this part of the world we discriminate against, it could probably affect the chances of that kind of gubernatorial candidate. But that's even people in the public limelight. There's so many ways this thing affects people. People have embarrassing health conditions they don't want people to know about. So when you can't ensure security and this thing gets into the wrong hands, it affects people personally. Then we are thinking of also legitimate purposes for that's lawful basis of for processing. So if you're using consent, for example, identify your consent and make sure you record it. Identify appropriate lawful basis that you're using to process data. Legitimate interest is one of the bases that was cited yesterday. In this particular period where COVID is a thing, if, for example, we have laws telling us you should maybe collect data of people that come into your premise, for example, for purpose of contact tracing, it means you can easily rely on lawful legal obligation because there is a law specifically addressing that. So, and I want to be thinking about it is think of the executive order the Lagos State government signed at the height of the pandemic, for example. Think of the Quarantine Act, for example. Think of even I think it's section 45 of the Constitution that says in a public health crisis, for example, you can actually waive the right to privacy of a particular person. So you want to start thinking about all of those things. And if you're doing things on those bases, for example, uh, you need to document them. Then also, while you're concerned about the statutory obligation or legal obligation, or you also want to be thinking also about your professional obligation because uh, it's a profession that is heavily regulated and there's a very big oversight. And that's also because of how sensitive the nature of the job or the nature of the profession is. Then, of course, all you do, make sure you have measures, processes in place to safeguard the rights of data subjects. Of course, when you're disclosing, whether you're disclosing to third parties, um, the users need to be aware. But there are also instances where disclosure is essential or is conditional to delivery of service. So maybe a patient, for example, has a medical condition and goes in to see um, how gynecologist, for example, a gynecologist, maybe the nature of the condition also means the gynecologist needs to check in with a physiotherapist and in the professional circle, they need to check and check and check, and also maybe get a foreign opinion, maybe get even a second opinion from also an expert that probably isn't even based outside the country. So what you understand there is that you're already making disclosure. Why that is important to provision of healthcare service. By the time you're sharing that particular information with service providers or maybe another professional that is based outside the country, you also want to be thinking about international transfer of data at the back of your mind. But above all, doing all of those, that kind of disclosure, for example, is typically considered to be essential to the delivery of that service. But at every point, at every channel of disclosure, everyone must maintain both the statutory duty of confidentiality and also the professional duty of confidentiality. So some of the things you want to be thinking about. So can we have some of the polls go up while I like catch my breath? BG. Yeah, so this one is saying, are you comfortable sharing your personal data with your healthcare provider? Okay, we'll be looking out for that particular outcome. Yeah. So the next bit, which I'll be looking at, is trends in health tech. Not only one of those important things the pandemic has taught us is how important this particular sector is, and how much of things, maybe the way we'll be doing things in the future, or how much of it is going to be contingent on delivering services through digital platform. There's an uptake, or let me just say increased use of telemedicine during this period because people couldn't go in physically to see their physician or see their doctors for different kind of conditions that they have, and consultation and all of those things, or even prescription had to be done from different locations, and of course done virtually. So the future is not in doubt. We're going to see more and more deployment of digital tools in delivery healthcare services. Wearables is becoming even part of our lifestyle, and some of these wearables, whether it's wristwatch, whether it's the one people wear to their hearts to keep track of their heartbeat and all of that, when people who have heart conditions, or whatever it is, whether it's implants, wearables, regardless, I mean, depending on where you're wearing it or kind of wearables or what wearables you're seeking to achieve. The truth is, these devices, for example, not only collects, they process massive troves of your personal data, send them, get it analyzed, and of course, give you the outcome. So they're able to tell you the number of steps you've taken, for example. They're able to tell you the number of maybe how prone you are to particular medical condition and all of that. And somehow we believe all these tools. Slightly unrelated, but I mean, a whole lot of medical professionals have problem with some of these wearables because, of course, they feel the kind of judgments they give probably not accurate sometimes. But we've also seen professionals actually deploying wearables, implants, for them to be able to actually keep track of what the patients are doing too. So this is what our future is going to look like. These are things that will become part of our daily lives. They are increasingly being part of it, but then we're going to see more and more adoption and, of course, deployment of some of these things. And of course, mHealth is a thing now. A whole lot of services have been provided using mobile health channel. Electronic health record is also a thing where so many medical facilities or so many healthcare providers are looking at it such a way that we don't need to move files and files around. Once we have an electronic management record system, you can move from one hospital to another hospital, and it's easy for them to access your health records. Then also, when we also understand the importance of portability, for example, it means you can move from one healthcare provider to another healthcare provider, and your health record can actually move around. So that's what the future will look like. That's what we're seeing currently. That's the trend currently. Then also, we're also thinking about clinical trials, medical research. If an healthcare platform, for example, and maybe you use data for medical research, for example, do you let the users know? Do you get their consent? Do you get their informed consent for the purpose of the research? Do you even ask them if they want to be part of that research? Do you ask them if they even like to know the outcome of the research? So all of these things are what you want to have at the back of the mind. You also want to be thinking about, what does the law say about conducting research in the country where you're based or where you're working from, for example. Do you need approval? Do you need ethical approvals and all of that? All of these things are things you need to have at the back of your mind. And medical research is a significant part of our future because we're constantly looking for breaking new barriers around finding those long-lasting healthcare solutions to life-threatening diseases. So whether it's looking for vaccine for COVID-19, we need health data for research. We need people to participate in research. So all of these things are so important. We can't close our eyes to them, but then we need to also make sure while doing it, we're actually safeguarding the data of the users, the data subjects, the survey subjects, and to protect both the privacy and their data protection rights. So a big data and health tech is like something that is actually quite big now because of the volume of data that we have and the fact that big data could actually mine and process data and give really beautiful insights. And these insights are things that we need to be able to make good judgment, and they are able to give us good analysis of our conditions and the things that we do, how susceptible we are to maybe a particular disease. So there are tools, for example, for let's say maybe diabetic patients, for example, that let them know when they are prone to an attack and all of that. So you're able to see all of these things, and all these things are only possible if the data is available. If the data is not available, it's technically possible. Technically impossible. So, well, the most important thing and the most beautiful part of it is making sure all of these things are done with appropriate safeguards in place. The next part, which is something I've slightly talked about, is how this also impacts, how the impact of all of these things we need to do also speaks to cross-border data transfer. So I'm a big fan of free flow of data. I mean, I'm not a big fan of data should live in the country because it makes things very difficult to do. So you're wearing a wearables you're using a wearables, for example, or using a chip or using an implant that's been embedded into your body to track maybe a particular medical condition that you have. And maybe the maker of the implant, for example, is not even based in the country. It simply means the insights, the data that's being collected using that particular implant needs to move to wherever part of the world the implant maker is to, analyze the kind of data, then get insight, is able to tell you whether you're prone to this, whether you should increase the dosage of this that you're using, or give you useful insight that can save your life. So if we're keen on now keeping those data in country, it might probably make things difficult. It's a digital world. We can't in one breath be saying we want a digital economy, a thriving digital economy, and in one breath saying we need to start keeping data local. Keeping data localization is not data protection. That has to be clear. It's not data localization. It's not data protection. It doesn't end up protecting people. And the most important thing is our data moves outside the country or whatever part of the country they move to. We should ensure that we have appropriate safeguard for the free flow of those data, for example. So, and the Nigerian law is kind of clear around this international transfer of data. I won't go into the details. For example, the law requires that if you're moving data to another country, whether you're an healthcare provider, whether it's an healthcare provider, health tech service provider, or you hold a mobile app, for example, and you share data with entities, maybe your investors and all of that in different parts of the world, you need to be able to first identify what countries they are. So the law is clear around the fact that if you're moving data to any country, such country has to have adequate laws that can safeguard the data protection rights of people as you have in Nigeria. So, and in the absence of, or where such country does not have adequate laws, there are also some other derogations like consent, even vital interest in Nigeria's case, for example, and even professional, some rules around professional confidentiality and all of that, that allows you to sort of move data outside the country based on all of those things. And I'm addressing those that specifically speak to the healthcare sector, for example. So you want to be mindful when you're doing this. You want to be sure you have a documentation of international transfer of data. But you can't even do that if you don't do like Dr. Simi mentioned data mapping yesterday, which is if you do a data mapping, which basically identifies, it gives you like a 360 view of your environment, of your architecture, of the kind of data that is in your environment, for example. So you understand where this data is moving. So if you probably run a check on your website, for example, you understand that, for example, maybe the server, your website server is maybe hosted in the United States, for example, or maybe it's hosted in China, maybe it's hosted in Singapore, maybe it's hosted in Ireland. So, and you collect information on that particular website, for example. So you understand that, okay, data is actually moving to Ireland. Is Ireland considered adequate under the Nigerian law? Yes. Then it means you document again. Like Dr. Simi said yesterday, your record of processing activities, you document. So if you don't do a mapping, you won't understand the environment. But when you do the mapping, you understand where the data is moving to, the countries the countries data is moving to, for example, and you're able to plan properly. So moving on, electronic health record. This is something I've discussed already, how important and how significant it's been part of our life. Patients can now freely, and there's so many service providers in Nigeria. I don't want to mention names, but there's so many service providers in Nigeria that deal with electronic health management record, where they build these records for healthcare facilities, for example. And it means when you're going there, there is no need to start looking for some physical file that could somehow be confusing or be so difficult to find, or where files get missing because someone paid someone to remove the data. That's something, that's the reality of so many things. Someone will pay someone within the facility, someone will go and remove a file or a record in the record room and stuff like that. So all of these things are developed to curb that. But it's also important that whatever healthcare platform that is being built, there's sufficient security. It has to be accessible, it has to be usable, and also storage has to be something that you want to be concerned about, and also access control. So who have access to it? Who can access it? Anyone, or just some high level officials, or maybe even the part of the record they can access it. Sort of, you have like some sort of privilege put in place such that you probably do some sort of data classification, and maybe just general information. You can know the name, the residential address, the contact information. But when it comes specifically health record, you want to be concerned about who should have access to that, and things like that. Then also, while planning your health or deploying health record management system, for example, you also want to be sure that you can also safeguard the rights of data subjects. So if a former patient, comes or wakes up tomorrow and like, oh, I was treated in your facility 2 years ago, I need my health record, you have to make it available to them. You have to make it available to them. So, and also if you're sharing this health record, for example, you can't do it without the approval of the patient. Or, of course, under the Nigerian law, the law could also prescribe or could also mandate such sharing, or whether there is a court injunction or a court judgment that is actually mandating that such record should be produced. So quickly, we'll try and look at healthcare in uncertain times. Can we have one more poll go up? Okay, I'm not sure that you can hear, but one of my is able to put up the poll. Yeah, so health data in certain times. The pandemic is one very big, and let me use the word mess, and it's changing the way we're doing things, and would probably change the way we would continue to do things. So with the pandemic, there's been so many things that typically wouldn't have been done in a certain way in the past, but somehow have to be done now. And I'm going to give inferences. So, for example, okay. Can we get your slides? Okay, yeah, not this slide specifically, but you everyone will get a toolkit midweek, specifically containing the content of this training. And yeah, um, the slides, not the slides specifically, but we'll get a toolkit that everyone can use and also that will help our understanding of this space. So, air data in uncertain times, typically, anyone who would try to like move between one country to another country at the height of the pandemic before the border closure, for example, we understand how um, when you get to the airport or whatever point of entry, um, the officials in that particular country will ask you to fill a particular form, to collect your contact information and all of those things. And in one way, you might be looking, yo, I have a privacy, I have right to privacy, you can't get my information, and all of those things. But we're in a public health crisis, and we understand that some things are necessary to safeguard, to ensure public safety. So, and all of these things are so important because we need to do them. But also, the most important thing is also to ensure that while we're trying to address a public health crisis, we are also safeguarding the rights of individuals. I mean, it's not a trade-off. It's not a trade-off. It's not um, public health or privacy. We are going to have the two. We should have the two. And why? I mean, we've seen countries where they developed. I mean, China, for example, color code classification was developed such that the color code classification could identify people with the COVID and those without the COVID. So it simply means if you have COVID and you've been color identified, it means you might not be able to access some social facility, you might not be able to access the transport system, you might not be able to even access some social benefits. Then in a country like Singapore, the contact tracing app was made compulsory. And one of the fundamental things, you can't make people download this thing compulsorily. It should be voluntary. In Botswana, the same thing happened. Only for the app, for the vulnerability to actually be detected on the app, where you actually realize there's like cross-site scripting where anyone could actually see the data of anyone using the contact tracing app. And that happened in some other parts of the world. In the United Kingdom, for example, too, um, the NHS app that was initially deployed, only later for them to realize that an impact assessment was not conducted. And there were so many privacy and so many security vulnerabilities on the app that was initially deployed and the government had to take it down. So, and in so many countries like that, you see things like that. In Qatar, in Kuwait, everyone was forced to download the contact tracing app. So you can't force all of these things on people. We've seen countries where they even fail to define how long the data will be stored, which simply means even after the pandemic, they want to continue to hold on to those data. And that's scary, especially in a country where maybe they have a very low trust level, or whether the government has a history of violation of human rights. So what I've tried to do is to break it. What are people's concern when it comes to when it comes to privacy and data protection and managing public health crisis like we have right now? So the first fear is always going to be around normalization of surveillance. So when you have a contract tracing app, so a contract tracing, like different models for it. And we have people who have made case for the centralized model, the decentralized model. So the centralized model essentially uses your real-time location. Why the decentralized model, for example, don't use your real-time location, but rather use like a Bluetooth. So when you're around someone who probably attested positive, he's able to warn you. So it's not reliant on your real-time location. But the centralized model rely on your real-time location, which will also be a privacy mess, because if the government is keeping track of your movements, they can use that against their opponents. You should understand. I mean, I don't need to use our country as an example, but think of it, you are a government, you have, I mean, which is something that is being done already, but you are a government, but you're able to follow your opponents in real time. So that's something that is actually quite scary when government is allowed to follow people about. And we've also seen instances where some governments in African country, a particular government in an African country built a contract tracing app, but the app was built by a private company who still continues to manage that particular data. So imagine real-time location data being available to a private company who might probably decide to sell that location data to advertisers, who advertisers in turn will now start targeting people. So all of these things are part of why people are scared and people are skeptical about this particular period and how privacy and data protection is being handled. Then, of course, mass data collection and interception. This also flows from the fear of surveillance. Then the normalization bit of the surveillance is also because the government might argue that, okay, we need to do this. Then in case we need to manage future epidemic, we need to continue to collect this data. It doesn't make sense. There is no need to do that. There is no need to do that. That would be like a gross violation. So in a way, we use the fear of COVID to now normalize some of these things, which is actually completely wrong. So also we have discrimination and inclusion, which I've already given an example of the color code being deployed in certain provinces in China, and also aware of some parts of the world where so many discriminatory policies have actually been deployed. You're probably going to find this in one guide that we also provide, that we also prepared for where we are addressing data protection and COVID-19. It's going to be part of the toolkits that we'll be sharing as well. So, so those are, you see, real instances of people being discriminated against. Then you think of there have been arguments around using immunity passports, something like that. I don't know if we've heard it, but immunity passports where you go do some viral test and they say, okay, you've developed maybe an immune system to the virus, it means you can have it. And if we are not careful, if that becomes normalized, we might probably see how this will be contingent on people being able to work, being able to go to work, being able to move around, being able to travel the world. So these are things we need to like stop at the very early stage before it even becomes normalized. So all of these things would create a very polarized society. So we need to be mindful of them. Then of course, absence of accountability. Governments usually don't like to be held accountable. And also because we don't know what goes on behind this processing. A government that is kind to you will make a privacy notice available to you. The African country I keep making reference to, for example, did not even have a privacy notice to its own citizen. It has a data protection law, but the data protection law has not taken effect, which means the citizens of those countries, now that there is a vulnerability detected on the app where users' data can actually be seen in plain text, they have no rights, they have no relief in that particular country. So these are things we want to have at the back of our mind. We don't understand the kind of processing, what kind of processing that is going on, especially, your argument is use decentralized model where personal data are not being collected. But for those who use like a centralized model where personal data of people are being collected in this particular period, or whether it's when you go to an health facility, for example, or when you go to a restaurant, names are being collected. We've seen instances in some countries where government mandates that if you go into any public facility or even restaurants or any of those such facility, that they should record the names of people and get their contacts. And people who work in that particular facility, like I was reading a story of someone who was being stalked on the phone by someone in the restaurant where she went to eat, and she put her name down in the name of contact tracing, and she was being harassed. So those are some of the things we're going to see. And because we don't understand what's being done, who handles this, who the disclosure is being made to, who the data is being shared with, there's no way we can hold people accountable except when things go bad. When the worst case scenario happens, that's when we know what's actually happened. And even when the worst case scenario happens, we still don't understand the severity. Maybe until when there's a future research, then we start understanding the severity of what's going on. Then, of course, the prospect that data could be reused for unrelated purposes. So, like I said again, if government decides to normalize, so part of the argument that has been pushed in data protection and from the data protection spectrum is that all data that has been collected during this period should only be collected till we're able to defeat the pandemic. Though it's quite hard to define when do you defeat the pandemic. So, there's been so many arguments from science that, yeah, we'll continue to live with it and all of that. But the whole essence of what we're saying is storage limitation again. Don't keep it for longer than you need it. Why do you need to keep all of these things for years and years after the worst case scenario is over? And such that this thing could get into the wrong hands, for example, or could be misused by people who actually don't need it. And I'm going to give you a case reference. There's been a instance where Nigeria, the Nigerian government, we don't know number of times we've tried to do like a digital identity or a national identity program. So there was one where Sagem, anyone who could remember that mobile phone maker, was actually contracted to do to collect, to enroll Nigerians. And because of a contractual dispute, with Nigerian government and SAGEM, the personal information of millions and millions of Nigerians currently sits with SAGEM. That's outside Nigeria, outside the control of the Nigerian government. So if SAGEM, I don't know their privacy practice, I don't know what they do. If SAGEM has decided to mine this, for example, I've decided to sell it or is using it for some other purposes, we don't know. We can't tell. Again, until when the worst case scenario happens, then, or there's a future research and there's a research in the future that speaks to us and let us understand the gravity of what is actually happening now. And that's something that is still ongoing as we speak. So these are the things we need to have in mind. And of course, the fear that the data will be returned beyond the pandemic, I explained that already. So how do we walk through this? How do we navigate the tide? Like I said again, it's not a zero-sum game. It's not a win-lose. It's not privacy or public health. It's not privacy or pandemic. We actually will have the two. We should have the two. We understand that health data is crucial to develop scientific solutions and also to combat the pandemic, but it has to be done respecting the privacy and data protection rights of individuals. And we understand where the exceptions come in. There's a constitutional exception that even data protection laws themselves do have their own derogations too. So, but when you're walking around the line of derogations too, everything has to be done with appropriate safeguard. Everything has to be done. Everything has to be done. And of course, there's also the idea of necessity and proportionality. Is it actually needed? We can decide to do contact tracing, for example, without collecting personal data of people. That's necessity and proportionality. But when you decide to do contact tracing and you're collecting data of people, is that necessary? Is it proportional? Those are the things you want to be looking at. A whole lot of employees this period do so many things. They do COVID-19 tests on their employees before they probably come back to work. And you want to be concerned when they do these tests and how are they able to manage it? When an employee tests positive, will the HR go to announce to everyone or maybe just tell someone and everyone in the office becomes aware, okay, this person has not resumed with us. Is it possible this person has COVID? Or maybe this person has COVID. And the way rumor mongering, like I said, we're a rumor mongering society, and that's something that's undebatable. So we know how the bad news moves fast. And even when this person maybe is not even having the disease itself or maybe recovers, we know how it's still possible people discriminate against them. So these are things we want to have at the back of our mind. Then once again, principle of data processing. Look at all these principles again and make sure you're whatever it is, whatever measure the government is deploying, or whatever it is we're deploying as an association ourselves, or an organization ourselves, or a service provider, we recognizes all of those things. Then we continue to respect the rights of data subjects. Derogation should only be reasonable, should be reasonably justified in the democratic society. And as I said, even when there are exceptions to the use of these things, it still needs to be done properly. It still needs to be done with safeguard. And the last bit is embedding data protection by design into the products that we're using to address this particular thing, for example, which means we take privacy from the scratch. You don't build a contract tracing app, for example, and you ignore privacy. And when there's a privacy message, when you want to start thinking, oh, we should actually not try to collect personal data through this thing. We should actually not use intrusive trackers and intrusive. There was a country where the contract tracing app, for example, had trackers embedded in the mobile app. And these trackers was actually sharing data with advertisers. Like, what we need to do is just to know if someone has the virus, right? To be able to warn someone within the near proximity that there is a risk you might be exposed. You need to be aware that maybe someone standing 10 meters away from you has the virus. But you are now collecting the use data and you're not sharing with advertisers. Like, there's a mismatch of priority or a mismatch of purpose. So those are the things you want to have a back of mind. And of course, impact assessment was another thing Dr. Sidi mentioned yesterday. Impact assessment basically speaks to being able to conduct to be able to look at if there is a possible risk and danger to data subjects. And when you can flag this risk before you roll out the product or before you roll out the service, for example, you are able to remedy them when you seek consultation from the supervisory authority. So also within our space, within the health tech space, within the healthcare space, there's so many conflicts. Trust is a destination. And when there is trust between the healthcare provider and the patient, for example, healthcare service delivery can function very well. But when there's an absence of trust or when there's a low trust and there's a mismatch of objective and there's a problem. Then ethics is something very important too. Um, ethics is something that is quite subjective too. But then at every point in time, we want to be sure we're doing the right thing and we stand for the right thing. And we'll try to do the right thing and of course um, mandate the right thing too. Then there are so many cases of violation have manifested in so many ways, whether from the international point of view or whether what we see, what we see locally, what we've been victim of. So all of these things are things we want to have at the back of our mind. Data breach is such a big news now. I was reading the news yesterday about how a medical facility in Germany became a victim of ransomware. And because the hospital could not access their own facility, a patient died. So that's how some of this risk now is moving fast away from just being a digital risk to a risk that is morphing into a real life crisis, a real life that is having real life impact on people. So we want to be sure we have all of these things taken care of. And the security element of this today is what the next facilitator will be speaking about, what we need to know, what we need to deploy, how we need to be prepared because the risk landscape, the threat landscape is so big. And also because health data is actually valuable. I think the most expensive. So because it's so valuable, so um, I mean, it's such a big thing. It's such a big minefield that those who are interested in it, those who are interested in violating rights, are keen on having access to health data. Then, like I will discuss sharing and transferring of data both from international transfer point of view, and also disclosure to other professionals. Then, what are the risks? And I took this quote from a particular article that says the health sector is the most affected sector in 2015. This is from a cybersecurity report for that particular year. Almost 2,000 incidents involving 392 million health records were reported. So I put some of these examples down here. A couple of years ago, I think that was in 2018, there was a data breach in Singapore that affected over 2 million people and included the prime minister of the country at that time. Also, a couple of days ago in Wales, COVID-19 test of about 18,000 people, I think, was publicly posted on the website for about 20 hours before the government realized and they had to bring it down. Even though it didn't include their names, but of course, we've emphasized the problem with anonymized data here and even pseudonymized data. It's still possible to identify people if we can aggregate data sufficiently and also combine it with some other kind of data. And of course, I already dropped the gist of the Nigerian HIV survey and how big a mess it was. But of course, nothing has been done. Of course, the authority responsible has gotten away with it again. So, what are some of the risks, privacy or data protection risk that we confront if we don't do the right thing? Accidental unlawful destruction, and it's possible. Um, whether by mistake, whether by chance, whether by even being deliberate, data could get destroyed. And this part of what um, the integrity, which is a principle of security, speaks to essentially. Then we are also scared of loss, alteration, and unauthorized disclosure. This is something that has come up a lot during this conversation. Those who should not have access to it should not have access to it. Don't disclose to those who should not have access to it. And those who don't need to know about it don't need to know about it. But these are some of the risks that we confront, whether as an healthcare service provider, as an employee in an healthcare facility, or as the owner of an health tech product. Then, of course, unauthorized access, which is also a security violation. Is the platform safe enough? Is your facility safe enough to ensure that those who should not have access to it, no one can come into your facility to steal your record, whether virtually or physically? So tracking and profiling, like I said, the example I gave about the country that the European country that built a contract tracing app that had trackers embedded in it. So with the trackers also, what you're able to do with trackers, aside being able to sell data to advertisers, is also the fact that you can actually profile the use of an app, or you can profile a user. In an app, you can profile the user. So if you combine having intrusive trackers with having intrusive permissions, permissions, for example, that can say to read the SMS on phones, to be able to access contacts and edit and modify the contact on a mobile phone, for example. When I say permissions, I mean when you install app, you know those notifications you get that says this also app would like to access your image, media, your location, where you keep saying yes, 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 because you need to use the mobile app. That's what I mean by permissions. So some of them will ask you, some of them will not ask you. So if you have those apps that are very intrusive, that could listen to your audio, can record audio on your phone, can track your course location, can track your media location, can track your real-time location, when you are combining with the trackers that has already been embedded that is also profiling your usage, it's very easy to build a unique profile about you as a user. And of course, I can do whatever it is I want to do today, whether I'm selling to you, whether I'm controlling you, whether I'm pushing things to your face just to like influence the way you think or the way I want you to perceive my brand. All of these things are possible. And so that's some of the risks that we confront both as a user and also as service provider, and also people who are also deploying tools and all of these services. Then, of course, fingerprinting and targeted advertisement. So whether you jump on a website, for example, that is able to fingerprint, it simply means even when I log out of that website or when I move out of that website, every other things that I still check on my browser, for example, I'm able to follow you. So I'm able to know, okay, you moved from, without mentioning any brand, you moved from A website to B website. In B website, you spent this particular number of time there. Then from B website, the number of things, these are the number of pages you clicked. Then you move to another C website and D website. I can follow you through all those spectrum, all those value, all those chain of your events. Then of course, commodification of data, which is selling of this data. So whether I'm selling to people, whether to big pharmaceutical companies, to develop drugs, whether I'm selling to advertisers who push things to your face, whether I'm selling to governments, or maybe we know how much of a crisis we've had recently where there's revelation or maybe research that says there's a particular company that is affiliated with the Chinese government, and when you use the app, for example, I mean, we saw what's happened with TikTok, for example. Yeah, I mean, I can mention that name, for example. Now they say data moves back to China. We saw the mess with the United States and Huawei. That they share all this data with the Chinese government. We saw what the Indian government has done by banning some apps in India, some Chinese apps in India. The United States government yesterday, the Department of Commerce also announced the move to ban, I think, WeChat and TikTok. So all of these things are not just being just mere privacy violation; they're also taking political dimension to them. So these are some of the risks that we confront and some of the things that we need to address too. You want to be able to be sure you're safe, your users are safe, your patients are safe. So yeah, so what are the solution? As a user, you need to read notices, but even if you read notices, if the notice, for example, does not reflect genuinely what a website or a platform does, reading it is useless because they just lied to you and they failed the transparency test. Then are you able to follow your data? And this is what I said again. When you're downloading an app, for example, do you know the kind of permissions? Do you know the kind of trackers embedded in all of those apps? Of course, you don't have time. You just want to use an app. You just want to transfer money. You just want to lend money. You want to take that loan and just want to do all of those things. And that's what you're concerned about. But the truth is, all of these things bear real life risk. They have real life consequences on us. Then I always say this: a data protection law in any country is as good as how the people they use it. But that's one spectrum. If the people use it and the regulator refuses to enforce it, so there's still a limitation. So everything has to come together. Every stakeholder has to come together. The regulator needs to do his job. The data subjects need to understand their rights and, of course, use their rights. That's only when we can actually start enjoying the benefit of the regulation. You can look at the regulation we have currently and like say, oh, it's doing well. Okay, it's not doing well. But it's not doing well for so many reasons. Are users invoking their rights? Are they asking the right questions? Is the regulator doing its job by enforcing? So, I mean, all of these things there has to be an alignment. And of course, security of data, which the next facilitator will speak to in a broader dimension. And then encryption. Yeah, encryption, pseudonymization, anonymization, knowing when to use it, knowing how to use it, knowing the limitations, and of course, knowing the strength. So all of these things have to like come together. Then data retention. I mean, I keep saying this, I'm very concerned about people who store data perpetually. It's expensive, but also it's a bit problematic. It's also a violation of the law. We know so many. Okay, I'm gonna share a story now of the Dutch tax authorities. So a particular Dutch law says, for example, that tax taxpayer should be stored for about 12 years. Then the tax authority in Netherlands deleted the data after 7 years for some taxpayers. So these people kept paying taxes without being recorded, or the record could not. So these people paid so much in taxes, and they didn't know why they had to keep paying. So eventually it got to the Data Protection Authority, their regulator, and the investigation was done, and they actually found out that data was deleted before its expiration period. Also, if you keep it beyond when you need it to, I mean, there are so many cases of organizations being sanctioned for storing data far longer than it was necessary, or the legal requirement prescribed. So all of these things are what you want to have at the back of your mind as well. Then, of course, implementation of policy on access control. We've talked about this a lot. I don't need to flog it again. Appointing a data protection officer, which is part of the requirement Dr. Sini gave yesterday, and also keeping a report of processing activities. This is a very strong element under accountability. Just document. You need to keep documenting. And yeah, it does apply. Retention applies to all of these things. And like I said, I made reference to there's a question. Yes, the toolkit will have everything that you need to know, and also the storage of data, the retention period that we're talking about. For example, it applies to medical records, and I can't remember the name of the particular case for now, but I know a particular health facility. I mean, a particular health facility that was actually sanctioned for violation of data retention policy. So the thing about it is also that there are, I mean, so many parts of the world, there are laws that actually define retention period. So like I said, the MDCN, sorry, not the MDCN, the one that regulates medical laboratory scientists and all of that, their body, they actually have like a data retention schedule they created for things like the results that they do in laboratories, X-ray, all these MRI scanning and all of that, all of those things. They have like a defined retention period. You see things like 20 years, you see 30 years. So there's a retention period for all of those things that particular law has defined. Currently, I'm not aware of any law that speaks to, it may exist, but I'm not aware of any law that speaks to any other spectrum of medical record. But I also know so many public health facilities also have retention schedule. For health record, it's longer. I mean, you see things like 30 years, 40 years after the data, or maybe the last contact with the patient. But there's a retention period for that too. Yeah. So checklist, I mean, these are some of the things you'll find in the checklist. Again, some of the things you need to do when processing health data. Some of them have been, Dr. Simi already mentioned a whole lot of them yesterday. Some of them have been mentioned in the course of this conversation. I mean, first identify whether even you're processing health data in the first place. Yeah, when you do that, define your legal basis. When you're able to do that, identify the lawful basis and documents. Then determine whether you're a controller or a processor. Some of the things Dr. Simi already said yesterday. Principles of data processing. I mean, it has to be factored in. Security, you can't joke with that. Having policies and procedures, protocols, and documentations to actually demonstrate compliance is quite important, and that also speaks to even the contracts that you have with vendors, third parties, and all of that. You have to make sure the contracts, especially where there's going to be like the personal data or data protection element to it, that you have either a functioning data protection clause in it, or you have a distinct data processing agreement that takes care of the processing that will be done based on that contract itself. Then determine if you need a DPIA. If you process sensitive personal data, those are one of the requirements for conducting impact assessment. And there is nowhere where sensitive personal data is being processed if it's not the healthcare industry. So you want to be sure whether it's a product, whether it's a service, whether it's some system or some aspect of the business, you want to be looking at it, and you want to be making sure you've done an impact assessment to be sure what kind of risk our users or patients are they vulnerable to. So essentially, when you have a breach too, that was the last part of Dr. Semi's slide, notify the data supervisory the regulatory authority timely, and also notify the detailed subject timely, especially when there's a prospect of risk to their rights and freedom. So yeah, that's all from my end. I'll be happy to take questions, but also if you could pull up the polls, well, I'll be happy to take questions at this point. If not, the next facilitator will come in and do his thing. Yeah. So yeah, that will be all for me for now. If there are any questions, maybe we'll take them at the end of the session. Dayo, over to you.
Thank you so much for your very interesting presentation. Again, to the attendees, if you have any questions, you can leave them in the chat box and they will be addressed during the Q&A session. Our next facilitator will be Mr. Nuruddin Odeshina. He's a certified information privacy professional in the European data protection law. He's also a skilled specialist and certified trainer with knowledge in information security, compliance, and more recently, privacy and data protection. Over to you, Mr. Nuruddin Odeshina.
All right, thank you very much, Dayo. Just a quick sound check, just to confirm you can hear me and you can see my slides, please.
Yes, we can hear you and we can see your slides.
All right, so thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Let me apologize. There's some bit of construction going on in my area, so you might have some bit of background noise. I'll try as much as possible to move to a more quieter corner, but then I'll make sure that doesn't take away from the session today. So I'll be speaking more on the security parts of data protection with respect to healthcare. And I think the starting point for me basically will be everything which I'm going to say or present on would ride on what Dr. Simi had mentioned yesterday as regards data protection regulations, principles, and those other aspects of data protection or privacy. And it would also ride a lot on what Ridwan had presented, just finished presenting. So my name is Nuruddin, like Dayo rightly introduced. I'm an IT security lead for one of the indigenous oil exploration company in Nigeria. Also the co-chair of IPP. One of the co-founders of a Nigerian cybersecurity community. It's called NigerSecCon. It's basically a community of Nigerian cybersecurity professionals in and outside of Nigeria. You can find me on LinkedIn or Twitter. Most actively, very active on LinkedIn actually, where I do regular series of quick and dirty talking about security and privacy tips basically, or taking a shot at what I call misinformation or miscommunications by supposedly privacy pros. So you might probably find out interesting. And if you find out that I actually mention things that are actually not right, which is a misinformation, please do feel free to take a stab at me to say, you know what, this is not right. And I'll be happy to correct that. I did a little tweaking of my slides. based on the last presentation, just add some quick introduction, basically just to quickly talk about security aspect of data protection. Then we'll go into the concept and principles of security, because I'm a firm believer of, if we understand the detail, which is what has been done over the last 2 days, if we're able to reach a consensus as regards what do we mean by security, what do we mean by privacy, what is a privacy notice, how not to mistaken that for a privacy policy, what does a DPIA entail. I think once you get that concept out of the way, it creates that foundation for the more complex topics, which privacy and security might be about. And I'll go into the framework and policy, then talk about risk management, and I'll mention why I'd actually brought out risk management. Maybe I'll call it security risk management, but then it's a fundamental part of everything which we are talking about today, or everything in life generally. On a daily basis, what we are trying to do as individuals is trying to manage risk. And I mean, that's also one of the elements of security or privacy or data protection. And if there are any questions and answers, I'll be happy to take them. I'll start off by this. I read something, I think as far back as 2011, I used to implement payment card industry data security standard for a number of clients. And there's a PCI DSS standards and a quick reference guide. And one of the things I read from there was that a US cyber criminal in the 20th century was asked that, why does he rob banks? And his simple response to it is that, I mean, I'm sure that's obvious. The reason why people rob banks is because that's where the money is, right? The same thing has applied to us today, also in the digital age, right? So people don't necessarily, even though it still happens in some places in Nigeria, right? People don't necessarily take guns to banks again. They'll probably just sit down at home, like our friends in Dubai, right? And this is no attribution to anybody. They basically sit down at home and try to hack their way into committing fraud or cybercrime, and also getting the money out of the bank. But for banks and financial information, it's sort of different, right? If someone steals my card today, I can call the bank to say, you know what, can you block this card? And they will probably give me another card instantly, right? So my PAN or my credit card information or debit card information, I can replace that. But when it comes to electronic health records, more often than not, it is almost irreplaceable. I mean, although people are doing reproductive change, but then things around your DNA, your history of surgeries you've had or illness, all those things are almost things that live with us for the rest of our lives. I mean, you can't just go to an hospital and say, you know what, can you change the fact that I had a surgery? Can you undo the surgery? Or can you give me, I mean, it's almost permanent, which is why you would find, I mean, there's a Verizon data breach investigation report that comes out every year. You'll find out that the closest to the most confidential information, or the industry that's often leading in some of these attacks, aside from banks, it's mostly healthcare. And the reason is this, Ridwan had mentioned that, I mean, this data is actually much more expensive than financial records. So in the black market, in the dark world, or in darknet, you basically sell a financial information for roughly about, say, $5 per record. For healthcare data, it's almost like ×3 or ×4 of that amount per record. So it's actually a huge business in terms of trading EHR, electronic health records. I mean, with that also comes with need to actually protect that information, which is what I'll be talking about as regards security. So I know a whole lot has been done about data protection principles, but this is a quote which I picked from during my study for CIPPE. Stuart Troom is someone I've worked with in one of the big four, PwC. He's also the co-author of the European data protection law in practice. He said, if data protection principles are the celebrities of the data protection world, then security is on the A list, a true VIP. And the reason is this, right? you will notice that there's some bits of recurring concepts or information that's been shared from yesterday or today. When we talk about data protection and privacy, there's no way we can achieve that without security, right? It's like you're saying you want to protect something or you want to secure something, and you're not, I mean, you're basically just leaving security out of it. So the means to achieving most of the principles or the data subject rights that have been mentioned in data protection regulation or frameworks or principles is always via security, which is why I felt like, I mean, bringing these two things together, it's always very important so that we are able to fully understand that the concept of privacy and data protection and also how security comes into play. And the question, like I always say, it's not always about privacy or security, right? It's not a seesaw, right? It's not as if you would, I mean, I think Ridwan will call it a zero-sum game, right? It's not as if privacy versus security. I mean, you need both of them together. The means to actually protect personal data or to secure personal data, to be able to ensure that you're able to prevent unauthorized access, like Ridwan had mentioned, or unauthorized modification of that data, is basically to security. And that's basically what I'll be focused on this, because privacy basically depends on security. So you'll find out that in data protection principles, security is just one of the principles of privacy. And I'm not saying that security is like the overarching principles. There are much more important principles that dwells on fundamental human rights. Security is just a means by which you can actually use to achieve some of these other principles of information security. I mean, for personally, fairness and transparency, it's like, I mean, that is something you should not preach to organizations or probably healthcare providers. Ridwan had mentioned that when he said ethics, trust, those are some of the founding principles of privacy and data protection, which I feel healthcare providers or healthcare practitioners should actually hold there in terms of implementing some of these requirements of the regulation. And you'd also notice wherever maybe Dr. Simi or Ridwan had mentioned technical and organizational measures. Whenever you find that in the regulation, it's always a pointer to security or a mention of security in the regulation. And I'll try to demystify what security is and what it isn't, right? Oftentimes, we always think about security with respect to protecting things, right? Or confidentiality, preventing unauthorized access or unauthorized modification, but actually extend beyond that. And that's what I'm hoping that I'll get to in the next few slides. I mean, it's always good to always give ourselves the sense check, right? The reason why we are in business today is not because of security, and neither is it because of data protection, or neither is it because of privacy, right? We are in business today because we, as an organization, we want to create value for our stakeholders. And that value can be different things. That value could be making money, or it could also be that we are an NGO. So data protection and privacy and security are basically means towards that end for every organization, which is why you find organizations today that say, like Ridwan had mentioned, we take privacy and security seriously. But I mean, really, they don't really give a, sorry, pardon my French, they don't give an F about what privacy and security is. They don't care about it whatsoever. I mean, they just have that written as part of their mission statement or part of their privacy policy or whatever it is. Right. So why security? Right. I had mentioned this earlier on in when I was talking about what the US cyber criminal said. You'll find out that, as in, on a regular basis, I mean, breaches are happening, right? What security has actually turned into right now is, I mean, this year particularly, there's been a rise of ransomware. Basically, people take hold of people's data. It's been encrypted. I mean, it's been encrypted, and they have like a decode key, which they are not willing to share with the owners of that data. What typically happens is that they go into negotiation and they ask them, how much are you going to, which is far different from what was happening last year. Last year, there was ransomware happening, and there was this bit around negotiation and getting payoff for ransomware. It was not very prevalent last year, but this year we've seen that change. Organizations get attacked via ransomware, and the cyber criminals go into a negotiation with them to ask them how much do they want to pay for their data so they can release their data back to them. I think in subsequent years, what you'd find is that the cyber criminals will just put a dump of that data on a public site or in the dark web, right? So that's changing a lot. Imagine this happens to an hospital. Imagine this happens to health records, right? Where healthcare professionals, whether they are doctors or any other professionals, are not able to access health record for a patient standing in front of them. I don't know if anybody has been privy to a ransomware. I have. I've seen this happening. But then imagine you are not able to provide service. Say you are trying to have a surgery and you need the client's health information, and there's a ransomware and all the health information is actually encrypted, right? The traditional equivalent to that is going to an hospital, say in Nigeria, and packing all the paper files or the health records of clients and probably just burning it, right? Imagine how a doctor will be able to function, or maybe an healthcare practitioner. So, I mean, one of the reasons why security is actually quite important is because it helps us prevent these things, right? If we are able to put in place measures to protect ourselves, I mean, it's basically just a means to protect ourselves from bad things happening, because bad things may still happen, but then you've put in some levels of protection in place to ensure that when those things happen, you are probably sort of covered. And I mean, that's basically a summary of this slide without going into the necessary details as regards what are the kinds of cybercrime, I mean, which is still all tied into this. Then, I mean, some of the issues which is probably recurring around security are things around attribution. I mean, because at the end of the day, especially for computer-assisted crime, right, which is basically a computer is being used to carry out the tool. You can never attribute it to a person or maybe an individual or a nation, which is why you'll find out that maybe today there is a news saying that a US said they have been attacked by North Korea, and North Korea denies it, and they say maybe it's Russia. Because at the end of the day, you never can tell whether, I mean, there's a meme that goes around in information security parlance. You never can tell whether it's a dog at the end of the laptop, right? You never can tell. So, I mean, there's this bit of attribution which you're unable to unravel in security, because people can change IP address, they can use VPN, they can use proxy. I mean, you never can tell that this is this person that committed this crime. At the end of the day, what we basically do in digital forensics, which an aspect of computer security, is to say that the crime was committed from this particular computer. But as regards who did it, it's almost difficult to say. I mean, my computer, for example, is being used by some other members of my household, right? And I know there was also a case law in European courts of human rights that talks about something related to attribution, where someone actually took a case to court as regards being attributed, why he wasn't the one that's responsible for that information. Things around transborder complexities around prosecuting cybercrime is also some challenges which we are unable to unravel today, which is why you find that there are people probably hacking you from Russia, from North Korea, but then because there are no specific international laws guiding cybercrime, even though there are some plans in place to do that, we're unable to get to the bottom of it. And I mean, data breaches will always happen. So back into the concept, I just thought to make that as a primer. I know all these things would have been mentioned yesterday, so I'm not going to go into the details specifically. Like I said, I always try to do as much as possible, explain some of the concept or some of the terms which I'm going to use during the presentation. I mean, so there's privacy, which is basically the right to be let alone, which is first described in the UDHR as the rights for respect for human rights. And I'm not going to go into the details. It's basically the right to be let alone. whether it is physical privacy, which means that I should not come into my space, whether it's informational privacy, which is what people call data privacy, which is sort of a word I try as much as possible not to use. So informational privacy or data protection. It could also be social privacy or psychological privacy. But then things change from 1948. I think back then, I'm not sure the number of computers which we have back in 1948. There was no Facebook, so to say. There was no Twitter. There was no Snapchat. Right? Neither was there TikTok. There was no internet actually in 1948. I think the birth of the internet was sometime in, if I have my numbers correctly, very close to. I'm not sure. I'm not just going to say it. Where we had the navigator, and the first message was sent from a university in the US to another university. So, I mean, from then on, information has actually skyrocketed. So what people need to protect no longer becomes their private life alone in terms of physical private life or their person. What they now begin to protect right now is basically information, because information by itself is also value, maybe more even valuable than a physical property. I'm not going to say the human life, more valuable than a physical property, which we try as much as possible to protect. So from time to time, as a result of these changes, it became very necessary to define new laws or new regulations that could ensure that we're not only protecting people or person, but we're also protecting the information, because the information can also be the person by itself. And you find out that in data protection and privacy regulation, there's still those two concepts that stand side by side, privacy and data protection, because they are meant to actually protect two different things. While data protection is focused on protecting personal data, privacy is still focused on things around physical privacy, social, and also psychological privacy, and also informational privacy, which is data protection. So, like I'm saying, what I'm saying in essence is that both of them are monitored very closely because of the values which they have. I mean, things around personal autonomy, but then there are some bit of uniqueness with respect to individuals, with respect to privacy and also their data protection. And I normally often use this analogy, which what I'd explained earlier on, which basically says that, I mean, in the Stone Age, the people of the Stone Age basically don't have any information they are worried about, right? They are basically worried around living, as in getting food, catering for their family, living in caves. But as we moved from that point to becoming tinkerers, builders, now coders, people using computers and using mobile data or mobile phone, we begin to generate a huge value of information, which has actually skyrocketed. And as a result of that, it's not only the person that needs protection, we also need to ensure that we protect the information, because that information by itself is value. So jumping into security. Security by definition basically is just a state of being free from danger or being free from threats. And when it comes to information security, which is defined by ISO 27001, it basically, this is what it means. But then before I jump to what information security is, in security parlance, when we say information basically means any asset that has value, right? So think within the business context, right? Or within an organizational context, what has value to an organization, right? Their servers, where they keep their confidential information or client information, the laptops that people use, the backup of those servers, their network, so that only people within the organization are able to use the internet or connect to information within the organization. Even the building by itself in security parlance is also an information asset. So information asset is basically the focus of information security, the protection or the preservation of the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information assets. So this speaks to what I said earlier on, where most times people focus on confidentiality and integrity bit of information. But then there's also that availability bit, which I'm going to get into and explain how all this relates. So, I mean, this is basically what information security is about. I mean, this is what I've spent like the last 10 years of my life doing, basically just to ensure these three things, which doesn't seem quite a lot, right? And I'm hoping that I'm able to demystify that throughout the rest of the information, throughout the rest of the presentation. There are some other principles of information security which we often don't get into. I mean, these are basically they are called the triad of information security, called CIA: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So that's the main focus of information security. There are things around non-repudiation, which basically speaks around ensuring that when you send information, you cannot claim that you're not the one that sent it. There are things also around accountability, there are things around authentication, and all other aspects of information security, which are called basically principles of information security. But these are by far some of the greater principles of information security. And I'll go into what each one of them means, right? Starting with the most important one, availability. I mean, I'm hoping that people would expect me to say confidentiality and integrity is the most important one, right? But I mean, I'll start by availability, because it's only when that information is available that you can actually secure it, right? And if you overprotect, over secure information and it's not available, then it makes it useless, which means that the people who are supposed to have access to that information, because you have actually protected it too much, they can't have access to that information, which defeats the whole essence of information security in the first place. So availability is one of the most important aspects of information security that speaks to how do you ensure that your information assets are available when you need it, are available to authorized people. Let me use that word. When they need it, where they need that information, and how they need that information. So I'm going to take that again. Availability speaks to the principle of information security that speaks to ensuring that information assets are available or accessible to authorized personnel or authorized people when they need that information, right? Where they need that information and how they need that information. And I'll speak to this with respect to things that happen around a breach of availability. So for example, there are things, there's something called a DDoS attack or a DOS attack, a denial of service attack, which basically means that someone is actually preventing you from accessing an unauthorized asset. So for example, it typically happens things around on the network or a server, for example, which basically means you are trying to go to a website and you cannot access that website, mainly because traffic to that website is actually being flooded purposely. Someone is trying to deny people are unable to access that website. And I mean, there are ways to do this. You can basically just flood traffic or flood packets to that asset, to that website. Imagine maybe like over 1 million people sending requests to a website to access the website. I mean, it's something that most organizations test their website against, which is something called stress testing for your website or for your server. But then imagine that happening. If a website is not properly protected against that, what basically means is that website might actually go down. It might be unavailable. So imagine that I'm trying to access my health record from that website at that point in time, and there's a denial of service, and imagine the impact which that would cause. So that's basically what availability is, ensuring that information is available, timely, and also that's also reliable for access for the right authorized individual. Then I'll come back to the items by the left-hand side of availability. So basically, to just quickly speak to that, these are some of the things which you can actually use to ensure the availability of information assets. And I mean, just some items which came off the top of my head. So there's something called RAID, redundant array of independent disk. And basically what that means is that it's basically just trying to create redundancy, which is from the name, in the sense that rather than have one server, why don't you have two servers, right? Rather than have just one website, your website sitting on a single box or a single server, why don't you make sure that's actually being replicated on another box, in the sense that if one fails, the other one is available. So that's basically what the whole concept of our RAID is, and it's basically used around for infrastructure. There's also load balancing, which is often used around both servers and also network, in the sense that I'm able to share access to a specific device. So it comes through a particular device that helps me distribute it to other servers or other information assets that I need to access. The other bit around controls is data backups. I mean, by far, which is very, very important. The solution to ransomware today, by far, is to ensure that you take consistent backup. So imagine that there's a ransomware on an healthcare practitioner information. Rather than going to that bit where you want to start negotiating and you're at the mercy of the cyber criminal, once you have a full backup, just ensure that that backup is also not encrypted by the ransomware, right? So I mean, things around offsite backup, maybe cloud backup, and ensuring appropriate security around it. You can always restore back from a last point in time, so you can actually continue business as usual. Then you also have things around co-location facility and offsite facilities as part of means to ensure availability at every point in time. So you'll find for most organizations, they have what is called maybe a data center in-house or maybe a server room at most. And they also have an offsite location where they can also always continuously have access to their data. Confidentiality is also one of the most important. So most times when people speak about confidentiality, it's almost very synonymous with security and secrecy, like Ridwan had mentioned in one of his earlier on in one of the slides. So basically what confidentiality basically means is to protect that information from unauthorized access, preventing unauthorized disclosure. So if you're able to protect the information assets so that only authorized people can access that information and unauthorized people cannot access the information, it is when we have a breach of, it's when we have a loss of confidentiality that we normally say there's a breach, right? And I'll try to explain this. I'm sure that maybe Ridwan or Dr. Simi had also mentioned this in their earlier presentation. We often use the term, or people often use the term breach very loosely, and breach could mean different things. And I'm also very watchful, which is why I said it's important to define some of these concepts. So what I said earlier on is that when there is a loss of confidentiality, right, it basically means there's a breach. But I'd also said that confidentiality means that ensuring that information is only accessible to the authorized persons. That when information becomes accessible to unauthorized people, then it becomes a breach. But breach could mean different things. It could be a breach of the perimeter, a network breach, which means that my firewall that protects traffic coming in and out of my organization, there's actually been a breach of that firewall, or there's a perimeter breach. Someone is able to access that firewall. That doesn't necessarily mean there's a breach of my confidential data, because my confidential data is still sitting somewhere internally, right? So that's a breach of maybe my perimeter firewall or my perimeter network perimeter. It could also be a data breach, right? A data breach basically means that someone has gotten hold of electronic health records and is actually available to them. And I mean, that's basically a breach of data, right? Which means that unauthorized people have access to the data, which speaks to things also around confidentiality. I mean, and there's also so many other things around breaches too. There's a breach of trust, which Ridwan had mentioned earlier on, while he was speaking to things around relating to trust. So how do we prevent this bit? How do we protect our information from it? Those are some of the things which I have there. I have encryption. You'd find out that, I mean, encryption is also mentioned in data protection regulation at some point in time as part of organizational and technical measures. Basically what that means is that you're able to protect your information. You're able to, for the lack of a better word to use, I would say de-identify the information, because anonymization is really not really encryption, right? And I'll get to that maybe when I speak to integrity. So it's basically to protect that information so that when you need it, you can actually, it's similar to what a cyber criminal would do with ransomware. They encrypt your information. The only way you can have access to that information is when they decode it for you, or when they give you an encryption key to actually unlock that information or unlock the data. So that's one of the means of granting confidentiality. And the reason why organizations do this is that so that even when your data gets breached, right, what the criminal has is an encrypted data, which doesn't make sense to him. He cannot see the actual electronic health records in your information. Then there's also things around access control, both physical and technical access control. And the reason why I also cited physical is managing your physical premise is also one of the means that is actually covered under information security. Because if people are able to access your premise, they're able to come in with a USB, plug it to a device, and go out with it, which is something we often do when we are doing a security test, right? And they go out with that electronic health record. I'm sure we've seen this in movies, but then it actually happens in real life, and it's part of what I do for a living. And you're able to, as part of testing customers' defenses or clients' defenses, physical security is also very, very important. And then there's also around integrity. Integrity basically means that modifying that information. And most times, before you can get to the point of unauthorized modification of that information, you need to have succeeded in having access to that information, which speaks to confidentiality. So that's basically what integrity is all about. So these are basically what's called the CIA triad. And all of these things are actually being done to ensure that you achieve your security objectives. This is another area which I would love to spend some bit of time on. So I'd mentioned the concept of information asset, which is what is at the lower part of my screen here. This is basically what we want to protect as an organization. Whether it's my physical premise I want to protect, whether it's my staff, my people, whether it's the information in the head of my staff, whether it's my server that houses my confidential data or my client's data or my electronic health record. I know that people want to have access to that assets, right? Because it's the crown jewel, if you permit me to use that word. Either for competition purpose or probably to sell it in the dark web. So people want to have access to that information. But information assets by themselves, right? They are very vulnerable. They can't protect themselves. They are weak, right? Which means that they actually need protection. And that's relationship between your information assets and vulnerabilities. So what do I simply do to ensure that I'm able to protect them, right? Install controls in place, and that controls help me reduce the vulnerabilities or help me protect. Controls to help me reduce the vulnerabilities in such a way that threats or threat actors, which are probably my cyber criminals or internal employees that are malicious, they won't be able to exploit the vulnerability in that information asset, and as a result of the fact, give rise to risk. And I often like using like a very basic analogy for this, hoping that you would get this. So my information asset, for example, is in the context of an electronic health record, for example, say a server we have within our organization, that's the assets. A server that houses all our electronic health records, right? Whether it's in the cloud or whether it's sitting within a server room or a data center. I know that that server, by the virtue of computers, technology comes with attendant risk. That is something we know because they are built by humans. People often say that maybe when technology builds technology, right? Maybe they'll be devoid of vulnerabilities. But then until when we get to that point when robots actually build robots, maybe there won't be any vulnerabilities. But as of now, you'll find things around servers having vulnerabilities. So for people who know about IT, there's something called Patch Tuesday, for example, where Microsoft on a weekly basis release patches for all their operating system, whether it's the server operating system, and sometimes even for your laptops or desktops. So you often find things that says install this patch, right? It's because the system is, it's designed to be secure, but then there are errors which we make that actually make those systems insecure. So, those are the vulnerabilities. And those vulnerabilities, if we don't patch them, if we don't treat them, they can actually be exploited by threats. So you find out that people actually deploy things around. So things around your malware, your 0 days, your hackers, all those things are threats that can actually exploit the vulnerability. And when they exploit the vulnerability, it gives rise to risk. And that risk basically includes things around people divulging your electronic health records in the dark web or posting it publicly outside for other people to see. So a means of protecting your assets is basically to introduce those controls. So the controls help us to reduce the risk, which can harm our assets. But oftentimes when we also deploy controls too, those controls also come with vulnerabilities. And those vulnerabilities, like I said, they give rise to risk. So, I mean, this is basically why my whole life is going in circles as regards information security, or for any one of us that are going to be involved in information security here, this is why I'm saying welcome to your lives going in circle, because I mean, this is basically, it never ends. It's a never ending journey. Assets will continue to have vulnerabilities. Those vulnerabilities, I mean, if you don't know them today, if you think that you have protected your asset today, by tomorrow. So think of this as what happened in Nigeria over the years. There's probably in maybe 10 years ago, or maybe 15 years ago, there's nobody that would have thought of, say, ISWAP or Boko Haram, right? But all of a sudden, we had that to deal with. People putting protection in place, but then they've actually metamorphosized over the years. And that's basically what happens around security and information security, basically. So one of the means to actually protect and reduce the risk to organization is basically putting in place security controls. And those security controls, basically what they do is not that they eliminate the risk, they basically help us to mitigate or reduce the risk that our organization faces. So we can never eliminate risk. It's not something that is, you would find that it's possible. So for example, say you buy a Maserati, for example, and you are living in Yaba. In order to reduce the risk of theft of that Maserati because of Yaba, for example, maybe it's a high crime neighborhood, you decide to move to, say, VI or Lekki or thereabouts. But then they have only reduced an aspect of that risk of that car being stolen. That doesn't necessarily mean you've eliminated the risk. Say you park your car, you still park the car by the street. People working within that area can probably just damage the car. So you decide that, you know what, I'm not going to park it on the street again. I'm going to park it within my house, maybe in the garage. But your garage can, I mean, there are people who actually pick locks. They can actually pick the lock to your garage, and probably there are even devices in place today that can actually start a car. Most of these electric cars, they can start the electric cars. Maybe they have access to that. They can actually get into the car. So you decide that, you know what, maybe rather than putting locks alone, maybe I should put a biometric device that you need to access the garage. Use a print, what's called, your fingerprint scanner, or maybe a face scanner. And people could also still break that because there are biometric controls, and there are ways to actually hack biometric controls today. I'm sure most of us heard about the case of Samsung when they released their first product that uses face face biometric. And someone basically just put a picture of himself in front of the phone and the phone unlocked, right? I mean, so there are means to this thing. So you putting securities in place. And I'll talk about defense in depth. So these are basically the types of controls we put in place: administrative controls. Then we also have technical and fiscal controls. And all those things cut across different things. So when you talk about administrative controls, those are basically things around your policies, your procedures, which Ridwan had mentioned earlier on, and things around your, so all those soft controls, whether it is segregation of duty or ensuring that one person cannot complete a transaction. Those are basically things around your managerial and administrative controls, and things around your contracts too. So Ridwan spent quite a bit of time, and also Dr. Simi, around ensuring that your contractual clauses contain things around rights to audit, and also sufficient obligations for the data controllers and data processors. All those things around, they are basically soft controls. But we don't rely on soft controls alone. So just saying that I have put an NDA in place between I and my employees, or I and my service provider, that is enough. You need to ensure that you put in also technical and physical security controls, because in terms of maturity, technical and physical security controls are actually much more mature than administrative controls. So just because you have an NDA in place with a service provider saying that they should not access some particular system doesn't mean they won't try to access it. So you put in technical controls in place, like an access control. to actually maybe a firewall or something that does identity and access management. So you're able to check that it's only your employees that can access those systems. You put all those things in place, and also things around your physical control, whether it's guards or swipe cards or some other things. Then we also have what is called the categories of controls. Categories of controls are things around, in different forms. So preventive controls. How do you prevent the risk from happening, right? Rather than getting to the point that the risk has happened and you're trying to detect it. So, all these things have preference when it comes to information security. You probably give a higher preference to a control that's preventive. So preventive basically intends to protect the incident from happening. You don't want the hacker to get into your information assets. You don't want your EHR records to be posted publicly. So how do you protect your server against that? Detective is basically after the effect, right? Someone has actually gotten in. So you find technologies such as an intrusion detection system, which means that someone has actually intruded or someone is actually within your system, but you have mechanisms in place to actually, so think of intrusion detection systems as an alarm, right? All those alarm that you have within organizations when people actually get access to places where they shouldn't have access to. Then you have corrective control, which means that the incident has happened. You're basically trying to correct the issue from happening, right? That's also basically after the effect. You're putting in fixes in place. Deterrent control, an example I like using for that is while growing up, there used to be this thing around, which I seen in homes back then, where they'll say, beware of dogs. I later found out that sometimes in those homes, there are actually no dogs there. But then when you see those signs, it basically you want to think twice around going into those buildings. So those are basically deterrent controls. So things around that, or all those signs that says for authorized personnel only. Those are things that you also need to put in place. Then you also have recovery controls and compensating controls. Your recovery controls are things around that speaks to disaster recovery, which means that the incident has actually happened. How do you continue operations as an organization? And also it takes you back to your regular operations. So I'm speaking to this because all these things are what you use for what is a concept in information security, which is called defense in depth. I explained this when I went into you protecting your car. So the reason why you just don't focus on protecting the server, for example, or the system that your electronic health record sits alone is, you need to do much more than that, right? Don't forget that. And this is something which we do in information security, which we'll get into when we talk about risk management. So you said you have your electronic health records in the cloud, right? Maybe, and maybe it's an outsourced, a collocated cloud, or maybe you've actually used an Azure instance or AWS instance, and they are basically offering you protection in the cloud, meaning that you don't need to worry about security, which doesn't necessarily is true. But don't forget that your employees also have access to these records, right? And sometimes they actually download these records, right? Which means that a residue of that record is also in employees' laptops. Your employees also send these records to maybe service providers via email or via other transfer mechanism, maybe in USB sticks or other means. So we need to think of security in that sense, which is why the concept of defense in depth is actually being used in security. You don't just, so everything that has a connection to the assets, right? You need to walk down that lane and see what kind of protection can you put in place to ensure that people do not have access to the assets. So you've talked about the cloud, for example, the information is sitting in the cloud, right? So how do you ensure that that information is only your employees that can have access to it, right? So you need to secure the cloud. One of the means of securing the cloud probably mean putting in a web application firewall, for example. And this is me just mentioning some technical terms which you might not need to worry about, right? For the web application firewall, you also need to ensure that you have appropriate access controls, or you want to ensure that even the traffic that takes you to that web application, which is in the cloud, you want to ensure that that traffic is actually encrypted, which is via VPN. You're not using the public internet to access the device. You're actually using a VPN connection, which is actually much more secure. And that's when you now start thinking about things around tunneling your IPsec, right? For example, or VPN. and all those things. So the other bit also is that, I mean, so you have provided all this access control mechanism. That doesn't mean that the server by itself or the operating system, like I said earlier on, is free. You need to make sure that on a regular basis, you scan the operating system to ensure that there are no viruses, there are no operating system patches that are required. And if there are operating system patches, you also need to ensure that you install those appropriate patches on the information system. So that's basically the concept of difference in depth. And the last few bits, which I'll just like to summarize this first part with, is I had mentioned this earlier on, that there's a whole lot of similarities between, I mean, there's an intersection between security and privacy, right? And I always like to wrap this up with what I'd learned from Ridwan. It's something that, I mean, I've picked from him over the days. He says not all privacy violation is a data breach, right? Don't forget that in data protection regulation, you could have a breach of the regulation without necessarily it being a data breach, which means that the regulation has said you should do this, line items of requirements. So you could breach that. You can decide that you're not going to do it, which is a breach of the regulation, which would be a privacy breach, right? But it might not necessarily be a data protection bill. You have decided to, and you have decided not to ensure, you have decided that your DSRs, you don't fulfill your DSR request. And by DSR, I mean data subject request, or some people call it DSAR, DSAR. You said you're not going to fulfill their request. When they send you that information, you don't attend to it. It's a breach of privacy. Or you are not fulfilling their obligations with respect to protecting their data or putting those organizational and technical measures in place. It's a breach of privacy or data protection regulation, but doesn't necessarily mean it's a data breach, which means that data has not been exfiltrated from your organization. And it might not be exfiltration alone. It might also mean that people who are not supposed to have access to that data within your organization also have that access to that information, or you have with all intent and purpose shared information with the third party, which you are not supposed to share information with, which we should read and covered under ethics and on trust. And the other bit which you also need to note is not all security breaches have elements of personal data. So you could have a breach today. Like I said, it could be a network breach, a perimeter breach, or it could be a breach of trust. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a breach of personal data, which means that it is only organizational records that are lost, not personal data. I don't know if we get the concept. There are some, so someone has access to my server. That server does not have any personal data. Maybe it's a web server. I mean, I don't need to worry about reporting that to the SA, the Supervisory Authority, because there's no personal data involved in that loss. It's just a web server for housing, or maybe a file server for housing organizational records. So within security, I mean, when we talk about information and protecting the information, we often start off with classifying that information, which I'll get to in some of the policy. So these are basically some of the classes of information which we use in information security, and it could be different things depending on the organization. See, that information is public, in which sense, which means that you don't need to actively protect that information. It's a public information. You see, that is for internal use only, which means that information is basically for within the organization. It should not get out. It should actually be confidential, which means that only certain people within the organization should have access to it, and also restricted, which is the highest class of information. Within privacy or data protection, you don't say because personal data is public, that means that it is a public record. I know Ridwan mentioned something like that. I mean, that doesn't give you the right to actually use that data to say, you know what, it's public record. My email or my phone number is public record. That means you can actually sell it or share it with people. It doesn't work like that in data protection and privacy. Public records, if they are personal data, they are still personal data. And all those rights, all those principles also still holds. So in privacy, we often classify personal data into these two things. Is either it's personal data, private information, and sensitive information, which is what Ridwan and Dr. Simi had covered. And some of the principles which we worry about in privacy and data protection is data minimization, which we don't worry about in security. I can, as well as possible, collect as much information I want. right? I think it's only now when there's been an infuse of privacy and data protection into security that this terminology is actually being mentioned in security, which means that, I mean, if I don't collect that amount of data, then if I don't collect data, then there's nothing to protect, right? And there's nothing that a malicious hacker wants to have access to. So let me limit the amount of data which I collect, and also things around purpose limitation. So let's go into the next few, the next slides or next few sections. So having explained that concept, right, you would find out that everything which I'd explained is still sort of hanging all over, like fruits on a tree, right, or like leaves on a tree. Basically, the next few session is basically to put it into context, right, to help us understand this better. Now, the reason why we have frameworks and policies and standards, it's basically that there is a requirement or there's a need to ensure that we can adopt an holistic approach towards managing security. That's the reason why you find out that there are so many standards, there are so many best practices, there are so many frameworks, they are focused on so many things as regards information security. So part of the standards which you find and part of things which are used is things around the ISO 27000 series. So there's one of the series that's called the ISO 27001. It is often called the de facto of any information security standard, right? Which you can tailor for any organization. So any organization today that's going to say that they are taking information security very, very seriously, up to international or global best practice standards. One of the means for them to demonstrate that is to implement and get certified to what is called the ISO 27001 for information security. So most organizations today, especially within the healthcare, you'll find out that they have these standards, which basically shows that either to their stakeholders or globally, because it's a global standard, it's an international best practice accepted standard. It shows that you've actually implemented information security management system within your organization and you're actually able to protect information. Now, all the standards and framework, a disclaimer I'm speaking to, speaks to things around security compliance and also maturing your security operations. They do not necessarily mean that you are secure, right? So there's a difference between security and compliance, which I might not want to get into. I mean, they take you on that path towards security, but that doesn't mean you are 100% secure, right? Because I mean, security or your security program is not a destination. It's a journey which you need to keep on taking, and you just keep on going over and over again as based on new risk, based on the evolution of risk. So there's the 27,000 series, which is, I mean, I had to put that first because, I mean, most organizations in Nigeria, even within the healthcare in Nigeria today, are actually subscribing and trying to certify to that standard. I mean, it's a good standard to take a look at. There are so many standards within that series, from 27,001, which is the one the organizations can get certified to. There's 27,002, which is basically security controls. So all the things I mentioned in earlier slides as regards security controls, all those things are mentioned in 27,000. So I'm still going to touch that as the later part of this slide. There's 27,004 that talks about metrics, 27,005 that talks about risk management, and there's also a 27,000 series for healthcare and information security, which sits with the 27,001. If you're also an healthcare practitioner, but then you also collect cardholder information, which means that you process cardholder data as part of your overall infrastructure or operations or system. Other standards to worry about, or which you might also decide to adopt, would be a PCI DSS standard, right? It's called the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. So for every organization today that processes cardholder information, and by cardholder information, what I mean basically is that information you have in your PAN, your credit card or your debit card, both in information in the front and information at the back of your credit card, right? As well as your PIN, which is not written on your card, right? Or which may be provided depending on the kind of card which you use in the chip. You need to also ensure that it would be good to implement the PCI DSS standard. It also shows that you actually protect that cardholder information. There are also some other standards around enterprise architecture, which basically speaks to frameworks, right? The same way you have your pillar, your slab, sorry, because I come from a civil engineering background, sorry. You have your pillar, you have your slab, you have your beams, providing like a pillar for the whole building, right? Then you have like the blocks, the walls, and other parts of the building. So that's what the enterprise architecture tends to do. They help you provide that framework for your organization. So all the other building blocks which you need, you can put them in place. Then you also have specific security control standards and best practice and framework. One of the ones which I love also is COBIT 5. There's actually a new COBIT. It's not only an IT, it's not only a security control framework, it's actually an IT framework. It's actually called an enterprise framework for the management and governance of enterprise IT. It's also another framework to take a look at to improve both security and IT within the organization. And of course, there's the NIST. The NIST Special Publications 800 and 853. I mean, it's one of the best, and I'm saying this because some of these things, because they are global in nature, they are things you can actually adopt within your organization in terms of managing security. There's also the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, which is quite recent. And also because of the new era in cyber breaches, cyber attacks. I mean, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework is also a very good one. There are other bits that speaks around process maturity, your ITIL, your information technology infrastructure library, Six Sigma, capability maturity model, all those things are around building processes. Because when it comes to information security, we are not only focused on technology, right? It is people, process, technology, right? So the other bits around those processes and the people, and also some part of the technology. This is why you have all the standards, the best practice and framework. One of the most recent ones as regards frameworks is what's called the threat modeling. You'll find that is actually some sort of concept that's being used within information security. And one of those threat modeling framework or concept are things around the attack tree. The attack tree basically is trying to figure out who wants to, so it's something which we do as humans, right? You want to find out who wants to cause you harm, right? That's basically what the attack tree is. So you take a look at your server and say, what harm can actually come to this system? Or it could be your laptop. What harm can actually come to this system? And you begin to draw the paths to say, you know what, this is the path for this attack to take. It will come through the internet. It come through my browser. It gets to the information on my server, my health record. Or it could actually be my employee. He brings in a USB. He plugs into a server. Boom. Or it could actually be a supplier, an external service provider. He connects via VPN. He accesses the server. Boom. So that's basically what the attack tree is. Then you now begin to put in controls in place, for all those attack tree. And the reason why I mentioned the reduction analysis there immediately afterward is that the attack tree can basically, it can enlarge your entire threat landscape, right? So you need to also balance that, which is why you find that people often use the threat attack tree and the reduction analysis, and they marry that together, basically just to say, you know what, although this is an attack tree, maybe I shouldn't worry about this because based on my operations, I don't need to worry about this. The other framework, which is also very key, is the Mistral framework. That basically focuses on, there are things that in information security parlance today, there are people who are called APTs, advanced persistent threats, and they actually have various funny names for them. They are basically nation states or they are organized cyber crimes who are focused on either attacking specific sectors, attacking organizations using the same attack tactics. So they've been able to name them based on those attack tactics. So maybe it's APT49 and all sort of APT. If we Google the Mistral framework, you see all some of those interesting developments. That's why you find maybe some names which you find common. Maybe you hear things around Operation Lazarus. And I think they have some names for some Nigerian threat actor too. At the end of the day, we need to ensure that all the standards and framework, you're able to harmonize them into your information security program. You're not just taking these standards and framework hook, line, and sinker, but you are building your security program for your organization. And part of building that information security program means that you need to plan, and I'll get into the details of what planning involves. You need to plan and organize it. You need to implement the information security program. You operate it to see whether the controls are actually in place and they are actually meeting your planning objectives. Then you continuously monitor and evaluate, especially for risk changing. The same way we have framework standards and best practice, we also have regulations. So today, as an information security professional or as an healthcare security professional, you also need to worry about the many laws, the many directives, and many regulations which you need to also comply with. We have quite a couple of them in Nigeria. I know Ridwan had mentioned the National Health Act that talks to things around security and privacy in some bits. Out of Nigeria, you have the HIPAA that focuses on medical information and healthcare data. As a matter of fact, I think the HIPAA, and I think Dr. Simi must have mentioned this. I don't know which one is peculiar to the UK. For the HIPAA, if there's a breach involving, say, about 500 records, you need to there's actually an online site where you find information about breaches across healthcare practitioners and organizations in the US. I mean, it's mandatory for you to actually report it if you have breaches that are more than 500 health records. And there's a website which I actually came across as regards that. I know there are plans in place for Nigeria for that, but then I'm not sure we have anything like that. And I also am aware that TechHive is actually doing something in that regards. So there's also the IT standard blueprint and risk-based cybersecurity framework. I mean, it's basically focused on deposit money banks and payment service providers. So if you are a PSP, and an healthcare provider can be a PSP because you're actually providing you're dealing with cardholder information in some aspects, right? You might probably take a look at that standard. I mean, the framework. There are some things which you might probably find very useful in that framework. I mean, although, like I said, it's mainly tailored on deposit money banks and payment service providers, especially the likes of, without naming names, people who are involved in settlements and collections of electronic payments. There's also the NIDA data protection regulation, which is, I mean, part of what you need to worry about as regards managing data protection and privacy as an organization. There's also the cloud computing policy. I thought to mention this here because, I mean, for most of the healthcare practitioners which I've had dealings with, you'd often hear that they would say that their information is in the cloud, right? It would be good to also take note of that. And also understand what does the cloud means and the obligations you have as a cloud owner and the obligations of the cloud owner and also the obligations as a cloud user. So all of these things, you need to ensure that actually fits into your security program. So at the end of the day, this is what your security program might look like. And this is what I borrowed from the CISSP exam guide, right? So, which will be good to do here. And I've mentioned this, we don't just do security because it gives us butterfly, right? I had mentioned it earlier on too. We are doing security to help us protect the business so that Protect can actually continue to achieve its objectives. So what we often do in information security at the beginning is basically to understand what are the requirements from the business, right? You look at both internal and external requirements. What are the requirements from the business? What are the requirements from the board of directors, your executive management as regards security? What are the requirements from your regulators or any other external stakeholders? So you do an internal and external stakeholder analysis, right? To understand what the requirements for information security are. Because at the end of the day, you want to ensure that there's a strategic alignment between what you are doing as an information security or as an health security expert and what the business is trying to achieve. So that's the bit that speaks around security alignment. And once you're able to understand that alignment, you can go into the details of looking at what appropriate standards or frameworks can I actually use to help me address meeting my stakeholder requirements for information security. And once you're able to establish that, you can go into the various blueprints, which is what's covered under the Security Foundation. You go into the various blueprints for how do you manage information security within the organization across the life cycle, right? Whether you're worried about privacy, identity and access management, or your applications, or physical and environmental security, or even continuing business in case there's a disaster. And all those things will transform into the various security operations which you do, whether it's across managing the network or perimeter network, which has disappeared today as a result of people moving to the cloud, whether it's your internal network, which is basically connections of laptop, desktops within your organization, even things around your printers or shared printers and all those things. And you begin to focus on applications, your facilities, and also things around software development lifecycle, which is very key, especially for new age e-health practitioners. Most of them probably have an in-house development team that does building of their websites, their applications, and all that. So you need to worry about all those things around software development lifecycle, depending on which model you are using, whether it's Agile or DevOps. Things around change control, things that you also need to worry about. All right. So going into frameworks and policies. So I mean, the starting point for every organization, right, is to develop a policy. And your information security policy, basically, in summary, is what is management's intent and commitments towards security. What is management's intent and commitments towards security? So you find out that what is management's direction? What is their aim? What do you want to achieve as regards security? So that's what should be documented as regards your policy for information security. And there are different kinds of policies. So you could have an organizational security policy, which is like an overarching policy. You could also have an issue-specific policy, which focuses on specific issues. So you find that things, an organization would have something like, like an acceptable use policy. Your acceptable use policy will speak to the acceptable use of emails, internet, and some other information resources. So a common requirement within those policies would be that employees shall not use personal email for communication, or they shall not use the internet for non-business purpose, or they shall not surf all those malicious websites or pornographic websites. I mean, so all those things as regards the prohibited and acceptable use of information or information resources or email and the internet. So you could also have a system-specific policy if you have specific system within the organization. You could have an email policy that speaks to maybe your email system, or maybe your firewall policy that speaks to firewall and all those things. Basically just trying to state what is management's intent and basically what management dictates. And I have some various types of policy there, whether it's an acceptable use policy, which speaks to, like I said, prohibited and acceptable use of information resources, whether it's your email, your internet, and other resources, or laptops, for example, or mobile devices. You could also have a BYOD policy that speaks to how employees are able to use their personal devices on the company network or for work. You could have access control policy that speaks to logical access control, how you are going to ensure things around authentication and accountability and authorization, AAA, in information security. Basically speaks to things around what do you use for authentication and authorization, username and password. Do you also use an MFA, multi-factor authentication, which is a must right now for every organization. Passwords, the age of passwords are gone. People are moving beyond passwords. There's an MFA. There's also the concept of passwordless. So we can also look into things like that, because passwords are not built with security in purpose, right? And I think they have been overused over the years. We still use them primarily because people feel like there's no second option, but then there are new options with respect to authentication and granting access to system. So concept of passwordless is also one of the concepts that's been used. Change management speaks to ensuring that, it speaks to things around availability and also confidentiality, in the sense that if there are going to be any changes to your information processing system, whether it's a document, whether it's a server, it goes through an approved process, right? So you find mention of a change approval board. So all these things are processes, and they also speak to technology, and they speak to people within the organization. You could also have an human resource security policy that speaks to the life cycle of an employee, right from the time you employ that employees, and right on time you are prospecting for that employee, right? What do you need to do from a security standpoint? Your background screening, your reference check, and all that. And I mean, up to the time when the employee has been employed, to things around your cybersecurity awareness, ensuring appropriate segregation of duty, rotation, and all that, and up to the time when the employee is being terminated. So how do you ensure that you manage that process so that your employees do not have access to your data after they leave your organization? So all those bits are discussed within information security. Now, this is something I learned when it's the first thing I learned ever in security, which means I learned it from one of my esteemed colleague, Labode Alauke. He says the reason why we are doing security today is because of risk, right? And the reason why we need to do risk for the purpose of information security is so that we don't overprotect or we don't underprotect our assets. You want to ensure that there's appropriate security, and that's the way he said it, right? So you want to ensure that you understand the risk that your assets face, right? And you're able to, and it's only when you're able to establish that risk that you can deploy security controls. And while you are deploying that security controls, you want to ensure that that security control is appropriate to the risk that the asset face, so that you're not overprotecting the asset, which would basically mean that you're wasting money, or you're underprotecting the asset, which means that it's being penny wise, pound foolish, right? That's the reason why we do security. You are basically just managing risk. With respect to risk management, this is basically what we do. And I mean, I'm getting to the final part of the slide. Before you can start up with risks, right, you need to understand the context of the organization, right? And part of understanding the context of the organization is understanding where do the organization exist today. So most of the organizations that are on board today are basically people who are involved in electronic health records, right? So what kind of risk do they face, right? We've talked about health record breaches and all that. But beyond that, you also want to establish things around what approach do you want to use towards managing risk within the organization. There are the various approaches, and I'll get into that not very in detail, but then I'll mention some of those things. You also want to establish your things around your risk evaluation criteria. How do you evaluate risk? So that you're not being subjective to say that this is high risk, this is low risk, right? Living in Lekki, for example, might be high risk, could also be low risk. And living in Yaba could be high risk or low risk. So you want to establish a proper concept for that, a criteria for that, for you to actually evaluate the risk. And the reason why I used Lekki and Yaba, for example, is you can say that living in Lekki is low risk, but then it depends on the risk. If you're talking about risk of flooding, definitely living in Lekki or VI is high risk, and living in Yaba is low risk, right? But if you are talking about maybe violence, I don't know whether Yaba is even violent, right? Or maybe Lagos, yes, let's use Lagos as an example. Lagos and Abuja, right? So, I mean, we need to understand that concept. That's basically as part of establishing the concept. And the other bit we need to do around context establishment is really around your risk acceptance criteria. What level of risk are you willing to take? And most organizations do this. They have an enterprise risk management framework that speaks to the amount of risk. Part of what it says is the amount of risk which they are willing to accept. And this is being used also in business parlance, which means that, I can keep on running this business. If I'm not able to make 1 million every year, I can keep on running the business. So if I lose 1 million every year, or maybe $1 million, depending on the organization, it's still fine for me. If my profit is not up to, say, 500 million naira, or if there's a risk that crystallizes and I'm asked to pay a sanction, and that sanction is 100 million naira every year, I can decide, you know what, I don't mind paying 100 million naira every year. I'm willing to accept that risk. and I'll continue my operations. So, I mean, we'll get into that in details when we get to risk treatment. Once you're able to establish that concept, right, or the context of your organization with respect to risk, the next point really is the risk assessment. And risk assessment is basically three things. You identify the risk, you analyze the risk, and you evaluate the risk. As part of identifying the risk is basically for you to determine, I mean, the summary is what could go wrong. That's what your overall risk identification is. What can go wrong with respect to your information asset? And don't forget that I said that information assets are everything when it comes to information security, or you could group them into four things, right? Your information by itself, which may be your client information, your confidential information, or your customer information, your applications that you use for processing this information, your infrastructure, whether it's physical infrastructure or your server, and also your people, because your people too also need to come within the purview of risk assessment. So what could go wrong to any one of these three things or any one of these four things? You basically try to understand the insight of all these bits. Then also part of your risk identification is identifying your assets. It's often called asset characterization when you go to the NIST framework, for example. You identify your assets, you identify what threats are those assets likely to face, right? We have used the examples of servers very quite severely. So I have maybe jewelries in my homes. I have maybe some personal devices in my homes. So, I mean, what could go wrong? What are the threats to them? Threats of destruction, right? Threats of loss, someone can steal them. I mean, so you identify all those threats. Your risk identification also includes what are the existing controls. I mean, because they are threats, I would have said that, you know what, so I mean, I need to do something to protect them, right? And sometimes existing control is not being done within this part of risk identification, but depending on the framework you're using, it also allows you to do that. So existing controls will be things around, I mean, I have doors in my homes already, which I lock, right? Maybe I have a CCTV camera, maybe I don't. I don't have a CCTV camera, but right now, so I have a door, I have a window, which I close every time I'm not in. Those are some of the existing controls I have in place, right? But what are the vulnerabilities? The vulnerabilities is, I mean, I live in a shared house. I mean, it's not a shared apartment, it's a shared house. I have neighbors and all that. That's a vulnerability. It's a weakness. It could also be that maybe the kinds of door that I use are not very sophisticated. Maybe someone can actually bring in a wedge, maybe an hammer, and they could probably pull it down, maybe. Maybe they could, I mean, they could try. So identify all those bits, the assets, the threat, the existing control, which is optional, and the vulnerabilities as part of your risk identification. And you also identify what are the consequences that all these things would have with respect to the confidentiality of the assets, the integrity of the asset, and the availability of the asset. And once we do that, we move on to risk analysis. Risk analysis have different methodologies. You see that it's quantitative or qualitative. When it comes to qualitative risk analysis, basically we are just using it's quite, how do I say it? It's quite subjective, right? They're basically using color codes, terminologies to quantify risk. But when it comes to quantitative, most often than not, you ascertain a value to that risk. Some of those values are actually picked from your context establishment at the top right there. So you ascertain, I mean, you ascertain the value to that risk as part of, so I'm just going to pick something to spotlight here. So you do that as part of your risk methodology, whether it's quantitative or qualitative in nature. And once you've decided what methodology you want to adopt, you basically just assess for consequences, or you assess for impact and also likelihood. So what's the likelihood of that threat, right? Which is a thief in this case, based on the analogy which I'm using. What is the likelihood of a thief coming into my house to carry my valuables, right? So I do some bit of analysis around that. I mean, what's the impact when that happens? If a thief comes in and picks my valuable, what will I be losing, right? Maybe the cost of all those valuables is maybe 1 million naira. Maybe, I mean, so that means I'll be losing 1 million naira. But then you also ask yourself, what is the likelihood of that happening? I mean, I've not seen this in the, I mean, I'm not praying for it though. I've not had a theft in my house maybe for the past 10 years, maybe the likelihood of that happening is actually very, very low. So you're able to quantify that. And that's the essence why we said that, so that you don't overprotect or underprotect. So imagine that I'm living in Yaba and I am actually putting controls in place to prevent flood. Flood has not happened in Yaba for ages now, right? So why would I be putting controls in place, or maybe putting controls in place to prevent earthquake, for example, right? So all those things are around analyzing for impact and consequences in risk assessment. Then once we're done that, we evaluate the risk. The risk evaluation basically is a comparison of the risk which I determine under my risk analysis and compare with my acceptance criteria, right? To say that, you know what, am I going to accept this risk based on what it is? I have said that the likelihood of a thief coming into my house is very high. And I've decided that as a person, as an organization, any risk that is high as part of my risk acceptance criteria, I'm not going to accept it. I have to treat that risk. I have to mitigate that risk. So that's what your risk evaluation is. Then, based on that comparison, you go into your risk treatment, you treat the risk. Like I said, you cannot fully eliminate risk. There will still be some residual of risk, which you need to accept. And that's what risk acceptance is all about. The next slide is around risk treatment. So there are various means of treating risk, right? So once you've evaluated the risk, you found out that there's actually that risk, then you decide to actually treat the risk. And these are some of the options for treating the risk. You can modify that risk, and risk modification basically means that you're mitigating the risk. So you know what, like I said in my house analogy, I'm going to put a biometric, I'm going to put a CCTV, or probably I'm going to get a guard to stand in front of my house, which is an overkill, right? Or maybe I'm going to get a guard, for example. Right, so that's basically me trying to prevent the risk of a thief coming into my house to steal my valuables, right? So that's risk mitigation or risk modification. I can also decide that, you know what, I'm going to retain that risk, right? And risk retention basically means that, I'm not going to do anything actually. As in, I'm just going to, let watch and see, let the risk unfold, right? It doesn't mean that I'm not aware of the risk. I am aware of that risk, but then I'm saying that, you know what, I'm just going to wait and see, right? Then there's also risk avoidance. So the risk avoidance would typically, an example of that would be, you know what, I've identified this risk. Let me move from Yaba to Lekki, right? You're basically just avoiding whatever is going to give rise to that risk. That's what risk avoidance is. So anything that's going to lead to that risk, you basically just avoid. So if it's a business process, you decide that you're not going to continue that business process. So for example, if it's an electronic health, say you're an health practitioner and you accept cardholder data for payment, you can decide that, you know what, I'm not going to accept cardholder data. I'm going to pass that through a payment service provider rather than bother myself about PCI DSS and all that. And you could also do risk sharing. Risk sharing basically means that you are getting insurance to help you manage that risk. So that when the risk realizes, you're actually able to call on insurance. I'd also mentioned being risk aware. Yeah, it's quite different from not being risk aware. Saying that, you're not just going to worry about you're not going to think about the risk. So once you identify what you're going to do with the risk, these controls are what are picked from ISO 27001, right? And they cover all areas, which is why, ISO 27001 is often called the best practice standard for information security, which is why I'm recommending it again for organizations. Right? They cover every area, or to some extent, of what you should need to think about with respect to managing information security within your organization holistically, right? Whether it's from the policies to roles and responsibility, which is item 2, human resources, asset management, cryptography, system acquisition and maintenance. So sometimes when we are when we are purchasing new systems, or you're trying to subscribe to an online practice, online server, online service, you need to worry about system acquisition and maintenance. Then also your supplier relationship, because what we have seen these days, even as part of the breaches, is that some of those breaches are not necessarily from the organization themselves, but they are as a result of third-party relationships. We've seen that quite a lot within the financial sector last year and over the years. The same thing could also apply within the health sector too. I mean, so that's basically it for me. I'm running out of time because I've gotten a nudge now. I'm also running out of breath. So, I mean, my last words really is to always ask ourselves, right? We need to manage both things. What's your data protection risk and your security risk? So you need to ask yourself, like Rowena used to say, is my security posture today incurring intolerable privacy risk? And is my privacy posture today incurring intolerable security risk? And basically what it means basically is, what level of risk are you willing to accept, right? Are you doing some privacy or data protection practices today that are not tolerable? If they are not tolerable, I mean, if they border on ethics and trust, then it is something that I mean, are you willing to accept that? That's the first question, which will speak to whether you're an ethical organization or you're not an ethical organization, right? And I mean, which is quite different. I mean, I think there are some other standards and framework that speaks to that. So if you're willing to accept that, I mean, fine. If the answer is no, right, then I mean, you need to do something, right? So you need to change. And the same thing applies to security too. I mean, so think about it. Are you securing your electronic health records today as if it is your own record in such a way that there will not be a breach of that record? If the answer is yes, I would say, I mean, just keep on improving. I mean, with security, what we often say is that continuous improvement. They say the biggest room in the world is the room for improvement. Just keep on improving. And if the question is no, then I mean, you need to think about how do you mitigate or how do you treat those risks in such a way that it doesn't compromise on your business operation, because like I said, business operation is key, but then it also doesn't infringe on privacy or data protection as an human right, and doing the right thing with respect to information security. Thank you very much, guys. I mean, these are references from the slides. I mean, it's really good sharing this with you guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nuruddin. I think we have one question for you in the chat. So it says, when an organization has hired a data protection officer and the information he's hired to protect is hacked and encrypted, who will be held responsible?
Okay. A data protection officer is not responsible for protecting the information. You leave that to, and I think Ridwan had mentioned this in some session earlier on. A data protection officer is basically focused on things around data protection and privacy as it borders on fundamental human rights or personal data, right? So if the question is speaking to personal data, even though the data protection officer would be sort of accountable, ultimately responsible, I want to believe that there are security professionals in-house within that organization that should be responsible for protecting the information. So in terms of ultimate accountability, with respect to the law, right, with respect to data protection regulation, then a DPO will be accountable. But when it
Hello? Hello, Nuruddin? Okay, I think we might have lost him for a minute there. Hello?
I don't know if there are any other questions. Sorry, I actually went off for a minute.
Okay, are you done with that question though?
Yes. Oh, you didn't hear the part. Oh, sorry. I must just take that again. So what I'd said is that typically that organization should have a CISO, right? A Chief Information Security Officer that should be responsible for overall security of information. So in that sense, because personal data will be part of the information they should be responsible for. So the Chief Information Security Officer should actually be overall accountable for that organization. And in terms of the regulation or data protection regulation, then the what's it called, the DPO might probably be the one to answer questions with respect to the regulation. But then that's where that sits.
Thank you. Thank you for addressing that question. Thank you so much. We should be having a closing remark from the head of Digital Health Nigeria just about now. But before he joins us, I would just like to mention again that we'll be offering consultation services to 3 health tech startups to be selected by Digital Health Nigeria. So if you're interested, you can contact Mr. Wale Adeosun. His email has been inserted into the chat box, so you can pick it up from there. Do we have Mr. Wale online now?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
Thank you very much. So I was unable to join as part of the earlier sessions. I was coming in and out, but I appreciate everyone who has been able to stick around and listen to the panelists and, gotten feedback, the questions and all of that. I appreciate the time, and please look forward to us doing, collaborating with TechHive and other kinds of partners towards, just trying to get the digital health ecosystem growing and getting bigger, providing resources to different people that, they might need and require. And towards that, I don't know if it's been mentioned, but we will be partnering with TechHive for some free consultations for 2 digital health startups, around their privacy and data issues and regulations. So please reach out to me or to Digital Health, anyone in Digital Health Nigeria, and we can make that happen. Again, thank you very much to TechHive. Thank you very much to Dr. Simi. We appreciate the support, and yeah, hope to see you guys next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Wale. I've just been informed that some people are watching on YouTube, so I'd like to mention Mr. Wale's email address for those people.
Okay.
So it's wale.adeosun at digitalhealth.com.ng. Yes, thank you so much. Again, we'd like to thank our partners, Dr. Simi of the De Montfort University and Digital Health Nigeria. At this point, we have come to the end of the training, and we'd like to thank all our participants for your time and for joining. Thank you all very much, and have a wonderful weekend.